Stories that made headlines today. US President Donald Trump has played a clip in front of South African President Cyril Ramaphosa that included EFF leader Julius Malema chanting the struggle song Kill the Boer to substantiate his claim that white farmers in South Africa were being targeted. The Equality Court in South Africa has ruled the song could be sung by members of the EFF as it did not constitute hate speech. President Ramaphosa responded by saying that crime was a problem in South Africa and that many people of different colors were victims of violence. Ramaphosa appealed to the US to assist with its technology in fighting crime in the country. Trump also presented newspaper clippings of crime in South Africa and handed it to Ramaphosa.
When you look at the videos, I mean, how does it get worse? And these are people that are officials, and they're saying that kill the white farmer and take their land. That's what it is. And I have other friends in South Africa, I have people that left, one in particular that says you can't go there. He said they want to take your land, they take your land and they kill you. It's okay, and they say it's okay to do. Now, we're going to talk about it, but this is a tremendous, look, this is story recent. Yeah. These are all people that recently got killed. Yeah. And I don't know how it can get any worse.
The South African President Ramaphosa in turn told President Trump during the media event that at the White House that he hoped the US leader would listen to what his delegation had to say about the true situation in South Africa.
It will take President Trump listening to the voices of South Africans, some of whom are his good friends, like those who are here. When we have talks between us on around a quiet table, it will take President Trump to listen to them. I'm not going to be repeating what I've been saying. I would say if there was Afrikaner farmer genocide, I can bet you these three gentlemen would not be here, including my Minister of Agriculture. He would not be with me. So it'll take him, President Trump, listening to their stories, to their perspective.
South Africa's Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana delivered his budget speech earlier this afternoon, which includes some budget cuts but also lower revenue forecasts as GDP growth has been revised down.
Get Channel Africa on DSTV Audio Bouquet. Channel 802.
Inflation expectations are now above central bank targets in many advanced and emerging economies. And new trade barriers may raise inflation and prolong the cycle of higher interest rate. Turning to the domestic outlook, Madam Speaker, as a more open economy, South Africa is dependent on global trade and financial inflows. This makes us particularly exposed to the global economic developments. As a result, we now estimate real GDP to grow at 1.4% in 2020. This is lower than the 1.9% we projected in March.
A Congolese former prime minister was convicted of embezzling millions of a huge failed agriculture venture in one of the highest profile corruption cases brought under President Felix Tshisekedi against the government of his predecessor.
Augustine Matata Ponyo Mapon, who is not in custody, was found guilty, Democratic Republic of Congo's Constitutional Court said, of embezzling $245 million from projects including the Bukanga Lonzo development. One of Africa's largest ever agricultural investments, it was touted as an answer to chronic food shortages when it launched in 2014. 3 years later, production ceased when the South African company operating it left Congo, saying it had not been paid in months. However, Ponyo's lawyer, Laurent Onyemba, said on Tuesday that the trial against his client was unfair and politically motivated.
The ruling is disconnected from the truth and invalidates any credibility for the image of our justice system.
Onyemba said Ponyo is in Kinshasa.
You are listening to Channel Africa, and this is Africa World Hour. Africa World Hour, a wrap of news making headlines all day. Follow us on social media for updates, highlights, and exclusive content. On X, you can find us as Channel Africa 1. Facebook, Channel Africa. Instagram, Channel Africa 1. TikTok, we are at Channel Africa 1. And on YouTube, it's Channel Africa 1.
What does Africa's future look like? And are we bold enough to shape it? Okay. Join Channel Africa and the Thabo Mbeki Foundation for the 15th Africa Day Lecture. Live from the iconic Julius Nyerere International Convention Center in Dar es Salaam on Saturday, 24th of May from 3 to 6 p.m. Central African Time. This year's theme, the state of the continent and reigniting the African Renaissance. Expect bold ideas, visionary leaders, and the spark to reignite Africa's future. Be part of the conversation only on Channel Africa, the African perspective. Find us on SABC Plus and on www.channelafrica.co.za. Africa World Hour. Africa World Hour. Unpacking global headlines from an African perspective.
United States President Donald Trump has maintained his stance in the presence of South African President Cyril Ramaphosa that Afrikaner people are being targeted in a genocide. Trump hosted a South African delegation led by Ramaphosa at the White House in Washington today. The primary purpose of the bilateral meeting is to reset the turbulent diplomatic relationship between the two countries. Earlier today, Channel Africa's reporter Michael Mbewe took to the streets to get views from South Africans about the meeting between the two presidents.
A meeting that has sent many tongues wagging. From debates, analysis and political posturing, reality is the stage has been set for one of the toughest trade and diplomatic terrain South Africa never expected. In South Africa's capital of Pretoria, citizens have expressed their views on this much-anticipated meeting. Motsi Makoko is optimistic of Ramaphosa.
Today's meeting between President Cyril Ramaphosa, the negotiator, and United States President Donald Trump is a crucial step towards rebuilding relations after recent tensions. Ramaphosa is a skilled negotiator, and expectations are high that he will secure positive outcomes. South Africa is a respected global partner, and this meeting could refocus the agenda on trade, investment and cooperations.
President Ramaphosa's delegation includes a South African multi-billionaire, Johan Rupert, something which doesn't dwell well with Makoko.
However, the timing of Johan Rupert's visit to the United States raises eyebrows. It may be seen as undermining the president's independence, something that could distract from the main objectives of these trips.
Dr. Ndlovu from a township called Mamelodi in the east of Pretoria has different opinions.
Our president meeting Donald Trump today, so my concerns and issues that surrounds the citizens of South Africa are very crucial and very important to such an extent that these politics or our politicians that we call our leaders, they don't have a sense of emergency when it comes to the people on the ground. And as citizens, we are suffering because of their poor leaderships. As today they are meeting, we expecting good, we expecting bad. It doesn't matter at all what they are going to say, because they're thinking about the next coming elections. They're thinking about power, how to self-empower themselves, but forgetting whatever they decide today or they want to do in the near future is going to affect the citizens.
Political analyst Dr. Shingai Mutambirwa says the meeting comes at a very critical juncture.
President Ramaphosa's trip to the U.S., comes with a lot of expectation. His meeting today with President Trump is highly anticipated. It comes, of course, against the backdrop of fraught or tense relations. We know, of course, the expulsion of the South African ambassador earlier this year, had, brought the relations to a particular low point.
In addition, Shingai adds that the frosty relations between South Africa and the US has been exacerbated by the recent departure of 49 Afrikaners to the US.
Most recently, of course, the extension or, granting these 49 Afrikaners a special refugee status has also kind of further put stress upon already tense relations by obviously painting a picture of South Africa in a false light as carrying out genocide. So I think there's a lot of anticipation there. However, what I do expect in as far as President Ramaphosa's approach, I expect him to put on a full charm offensive. One, I think he is acutely aware of the reception that President of Ukraine, Zelensky, had received.
Michael Mbewe, Channel Africa News in Johannesburg.
US President Donald Trump confronted South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa at the White House earlier with the most conscientious areas of dispute between the countries, including Trump's claims of a white genocide. Trump has accused South Africa of seizing land from white farmers and of fueling violence against white landowners with hateful rhetoric and government actions. South Africa rejected the allegation that white people are disproportionately targeted by crime. For more discussion on this meeting in Washington, we are now joined on the line by Global Affairs Specialist Dr. Terence McNamee. Dr. Terence, good evening this Wednesday.
Hi, good evening.
Dr. Terence, this was a highly anticipated meeting, and one would be interested to find out what went through your mind when you saw how, the South African delegation were surprisingly met with a video that was depicted, as well as the newspaper clippings. What went through your mind when you saw all of that?
Well, to some extent it was predictable because it was so unpredictable. And what I've been saying for some time is that we have to expect the unexpected. And I think the main thing that was going through my mind was, okay, well, on the face of it, this is sort of shaping up to be kind of a disaster, but are we going to achieve our main objective? And that is, do we get out of this meeting and have we arrested the slide in relations between South Africa and the United States? Because that was the chief objective of the meeting, to somehow reset this relationship. So I think we're going to know the answer to that question pretty soon. But I think the question that's got to come through your mind about the president is, did he stand up for South Africa in the way that South Africans hoped he would? Did he refute the obviously false claims of the white genocide? So I think these are big questions for the president, and I'm not sure how this is going to play out back here in South Africa, but I think the interview does raise some troubling questions.
South Africa went there with, the sole purpose of trade, and that's what President Cyril Ramaphosa was generally talking about in his meeting with President Trump, and a great deal of his input focused on that. So what did you make of how the South African delegates were also able to talk to Mr. Trump with regards the narrative that Mr. Trump has on South Africa?
Well, again, it was certainly a disquieting experience watching it, because yes, there was a lot of talk about trade, because naturally the hope was that this meeting would focus on those things that unite South Africa and the United States, not those things that divide the country. But unfortunately, it did, as predicted, get bogged down in this white Afrikaner refugee question. And I think no one watching that press conference could be happy with the portrait that was sketched and outlined about what South Africa, the reality of South Africa, a country that we know has huge challenges, of course. But after watching that, you talk about trade. would anyone want to visit South Africa, let alone invest in the country? There was such a preponderance of attention on the extreme negatives. And I can't understand why the good side of South Africa did not come out in terms of the supporting cast. I mean, again, we had enough focus on the challenges, but I don't know why there was not much championing of South Africa and its potential, and for all of its challenges, also the achievements that it has made in terms of what is still a relatively young, nascent democracy.
You know, I really am not sure at this point as to whether would there be a need to weather the storm, because here you are talking about what investors would think given the picture that was painted. Would there be a need to weather the storm? I mean, do we now have to start selling South Africa more, or we still on the right trajectory?
Well, again, I would ask, the fact is that there were a number of audiences, of course, for this press conference, right? There was the audience back home and the political context back in South Africa. There was, of course, the US and the DC audience, and there was the rest of the world. But whilst this event has completely consumed the South African media and so forth, around the rest of the world, including the United States, people only started to pick up on this meeting earlier in the day. It wasn't a huge story. And so what is the story now that's emerging from this meeting? And again, I just think there was enough time to prepare for this meeting to ensure that the South African delegation got out its core messages, right? Now, they could never control this environment, but of course, they can control how they react to this environment. And there was certainly enough time. I mean, President Ramaphosa got way more airtime than I might have imagined, and that other world leaders got. I mean, if you imagine that Prime Minister Mark Carney of Canada, I mean, he barely uttered more than 50 or 60 words in his press conference, but he made them all count, right? And I've always been emphasizing that in a meeting like this, less is more. And if you start having to explain things like the fact that there is no white genocide going on in South Africa, if you start having to explain it, then you're losing. So, we should have really, really kicked that question to the curb. Of course, President Donald Trump is heavily invested in this issue. Of course he has. But I think the team had enough preparation to prepare those lines, to prepare those responses, and particularly when the whole Shoot the Boer film came up.
President Cyril Ramaphosa is widely known as a good negotiator. And, he kept on referring to the late President Nelson Mandela in how he championed peace, and he used the sport, to foster peace, and how South Africa was able to overcome apartheid. Don't you think that maybe that also on its own stuck out and was in actual fact factually good for the meeting to actually set that as a reminder to the rest of the world, and how South Africa, as it's important in the international system, has been actually able to also overcome adversaries, and because of living examples?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could probably look at the surfacing of Mandela a number of different ways. I mean, yes, what it did is that it certainly appealed to the sort of better angels of South Africa, but it also harked back to a time when South Africa had enormous international political capital and really was one of the countries in the world that inspired so many others in terms of its democratic transition and just the sheer excellence and nobility of a leader like Nelson Mandela. So on the one hand, yes, the fact that that was raised was a reminder, I guess, of where South Africa once stood in terms of the sort of global international community. But if you remember, it was also brought up by the supporting cast, and it was brought up in a way that suggested that the current government, at least this was my read, and I could be wrong, but my reading was when it was brought up, it seemed to suggest that President Mandela was someone that didn't see race. He was someone that said all South Africans are equal before the law and so forth, where I think the implication and suggestion is that certain minority groups are perhaps being unfairly treated in the new political dispensation, or at least in terms of under the current administration. That might have been an implication that some people might have got from the evocation of President Mandela. But yeah, I mean, it was an effort to try to appeal, as I said, to the kind of better angels. But whether it fell on deaf ears or not, I'm not certain.
Mm. And I'm sure you also paid attention to what the delegates said, what they said, because they were also given an opportunity to say something about South Africa. And John Steenhuisen, from the leader of the Democratic Alliance, also said something. Do you think what he said also may have created an impact?
Well, I think the whole arrangement was to present an image of South Africa, right? Everyone that was gathered there in their own way was a kind of almost a symbol of the fact that the narrative about South Africa being presented by the Trump administration is incorrect. Of course, it was interesting that Ramaphosa went to John Steenhuisen. I mean, he was the only person that he went to try and clarify this issue. And I felt, and again, I could be, I've just watched it just like you have, but it felt like a little bit of a desperate move in the sense that things were not going well clearly in the meeting. And I think that Ramaphosa certainly lent on Steenhuisen to say, hey, listen, we're all in this together. We're a government of national unity. I think maybe Ramaphosa had hoped that Steenhuisen would come out and say, listen, I'm the Minister of Agriculture. I work with white farmers. There is no white genocide in South Africa. But he didn't say that clearly. And in fact, no one said it, which I thought was a huge disappointment of the meeting. Because, had Ramaphosa been armed with a few simple facts and just had it there, well, however tragic, and of course it's tragic in terms of the number of white farmers that have been killed in South Africa, whatever that number is, it's of course tragic. But if he was able to just present those numbers, anyone listening would realize a tragedy, but certainly no genocide.
Now, the chanting of the song, the court in South Africa, the Equality Court, ruled that the song could be sung by members of the EFF. But now it seems like it being sung is sending jitters across the international system's spinal. And I'm sure, in your view, that could continue to show South Africa in a very different light, in particular, than Vesta.
Well, it did. And again, not to be too critical, but I did have high hopes for President Ramaphosa in this meeting. And I even suggested on an earlier piece that I did, an earlier interview, that he could have a great ready-made response to when the shoot the Boer issue in Julius Malema came up. And it was an easy one. And he could have said that this is a song from our past. Personally, I now find it repugnant. It should not be sung in South Africa. My party also believes it should not be sung, and I will work and do whatever I possibly can to try and ensure that it never is sung. However, we are in a free society, and we have a constitutional court that determined that this falls under free speech. And however much I don't like that, I have to abide by the constitutional court because it is the ultimate interpreter of our laws. So to some extent, he could have taken that attack line and almost turned it into a win. And perhaps, President Trump might have been impressed by his emphasizing about how much he personally disliked that song being sung. But again, that wasn't really the tack that was taken. And it ended up being, I think, the responses were a little bit too long-winded and verbose. You know, they should have been much more crisp, much more decisive in response to that. And, you know, Julius Malema is the leader of a party that has less than, I think, 10% of the vote. And really that should have been emphasized more, that this is a fringe element in South Africa, despite the crowded stadium. And, you know, I mean, it was the idea that President Trump was telling the leader of a country what was going on in his own country and presenting him with information that he could have easily dispelled with facts, but chose not to do so, is a little bit odd to me, to say the least.
Yeah, I think the narrative still has to change, because even when Mr. Trump opened up his speech, when he was welcoming President Ramaphosa, describing him as a controversial leader in a way, I didn't really know where that came from, though stated that he's very respected. Did you think anything into that?
No, none of that stuff, I mean, doesn't matter, really. We can't hang on, you know, President Trump's every little, you know, linguistic turn, because we don't know what he's going to say next. You know, we can't get thrown off by those things. And again, I hark back to the last meeting in the Oval Office with Canada's Prime Minister, Mark Carney. Now, to some extent, that was an even more potentially combustible meeting, because President Trump had been talking ad nauseum about annexing Canada, turning it into the 51st state, right? And he said a number of things too, but the point is that you just don't rise to them. You remain calm, you stick to your script, and you remember the lines that you need to get out there. And that's it. And there's only so much you can do. You can't control that environment or what he's going to say, but you can control your reaction and your response.
No, Dr. Terence McNamee, thank you very much for your analysis this evening. And I'm sure we'll get to know tomorrow, as well as days go by, the decisions that had been taken from this meeting. Thank you for your time.
Pleasure.
That was Dr. Terence McNamee, Global Affairs Specialist.
In this episode of Channel Africa Conversations, Peter talks to Dr. Thabiso Lehoko, an academic, author, and an expert in indigenous knowledge systems. Join us for a compelling discussion on preserving African languages and traditions in the digital era. Dr. Thabiso unpacks the role of educators, explorers, and how technologies like AI can support cultural preservation, and challenges us to rethink how we honor African heritage. You can find the episode on YouTube, SABC Plus, and on our website, channelafrica.co.za. This episode is a must-listen for educators, creators, and change makers across the continent. Channel Africa, the African perspective. Africa World Hour. Africa World Hour. Unpacking global headlines from an African perspective.
Yes, we come into you live from an African perspective. My name is Thabiso Lehoko, and we are in Johannesburg. South Africa's Finance Minister, Enoch Godongwana, finally tabled a budget in Parliament on Wednesday. He says the decision to do away with the controversial VAT increase without a viable alternative source of revenue significantly reduced the government's ability to fund additional programs. This is the third attempt by the minister after the two previous budgets failed because of a proposed increase in the value-added tax to 16%. Dimakazo Leshuru has the details.
An increase in VAT would have contributed $735 million this year and $1.1 billion next year to the fiscus. But the contestation over VAT increases and a lower tax base, together with slow growth, means there's little room for Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana and his team to raise revenue. Presenting the proposed budget on Wednesday, the minister slashed revenue projections and additional government expenditure for this year and the next 2 years. From June, the fuel levy will see an inflation-linked increase after a 3-year freeze.
The past 2 months have provided valuable lessons that will inform how we manage the budget process moving forward. The reality, however, is that the decision to do away with the VAT increase without a viable alternative source of revenue significantly reduce our ability to fund additional government programs and projects to the extent we had deemed necessary.
Economic growth projections are downwardly revised from the March estimate of 1.9% for 2025 to now 1.4%. Kotongwana says the slower growth forecast has weakened the outlook for key tax bases. Revenue is expected to be lower by $3.4 billion from the March estimates. However, the Revenue Service has been allocated an additional $223 million over the 3 years to put systems in place to improve revenue collection.
The 2026 budget will therefore need to propose new tax measures aimed at raising 20 billion rand. We have allocated an additional 7.5 billion over the medium term to increase the effectiveness of the South African Revenue Services in collecting more revenue. Part of this allocation will be used to increase collection from debts owed to the fiscus. SARS has indicated that this could raise between 20 billion and 15 billion and 50 billion in additional revenue per year.
The threshold for property tax has been increased to over 1.2 million South African rand. This means there will be no tax applicable for properties below this amount. At the same time, non-interest spending will now grow at a slower pace of 5.4% annually from $134 billion to $139 billion in the current financial year to $156 billion in the outer year of the medium-term expenditure framework. Public debt will increase more than anticipated at the March budget. Debt will now rise from $318 billion in 2024 to $335 billion this year at 77.4% of GDP, while interest on debt costs remain the biggest spending item in the budget, crowding out other spending. Despite these increases, the minister says he is not losing the battle against debt, adding that the numbers are a mere reflection of the decline in nominal GDP.
If you look at this latest figure, it's not as a result of any fiscal slippage. It is as a result of the GDP changes, as DG was saying, that sensitivity debt to GDP ratio. So because of the changes on the GDP, to test that, whether we're winning the battle, is first, to win the battle, there must be a political and say fiscal consolidation for its success is a political economic question. Is there a political acceptance within the system that is a major problem and you have got to deal with it?
A big chunk of the budget will go towards infrastructure build and repairing existing infrastructure. The National Treasury is looking to cut spending inefficiencies and doing away with duplications to save money.
We are not deaf to the public's concern about wasteful and inefficient expenditure. Our commitment to collect taxes must be matched by better efficiencies in how that money is spent. It must be matched by much stricter oversight that quickly identifies problems and provides timely solutions when things go wrong. We found potential savings of about 37.5 billion over the time through improved oversight and political changes through these reviews, operational changes. Going forward, underperforming programs will be closed as the 2026 MTF budget process undergoes redesign. New reforms will target infrastructure planning and implementation across provinces and municipalities.
800 doctors are expected to be hired this year, and some funding will go towards securing posts of 5,500 teachers that were at risk of losing their jobs, and the early retirement program has been reduced to $307 million from $615 million and there are only 15,000 employees that are affected for now. For Channel Africa News, I'm Thabiso Lehoko in Pretoria.
Italy's Constitutional Court considered for the first time arguments about the constitutional legitimacy of a law that imposes sanctions on sea rescue groups. Human Rights Watch and the European Centre for Constitutional and Human Rights were both permitted to intervene, as amici curiae, or friends of the court, in the historic case, submitting written briefs that address Italy's international legal obligations. For more on this, I spoke to Judith Sunderland, Associate Europe and Central Asia Director at Human Rights Watch. Judith, what happened actually in Italy in court today?
Well, it was a hearing at the Constitutional Court, which is, of course, the highest court in Italy that assesses whether laws and policies are constitutional. And it's a very beautiful old building. The judges are in robes. It's a very solemn, serious event. And today they heard the case that about this law that Italy has since the beginning of 2023 that basically allows the government to punish rescue organizations, so the organizations that operate ships in the central Mediterranean, doing patrols and rescuing people who are in distress at sea. The law allows the government to punish those organizations if they argue that they did not obey instructions by the Libyan Coast Guard. And this is very important because we and many others have documented so much abuse by the Libyan Coast Guard and against migrants and refugees in Libya in general that we believe it's unlawful and goes against Italy's international obligations under human rights law to punish organizations for helping people to avoid the abuse that they otherwise face in Libya.
Mm. Now, what are the potential constitutional implications of the Italian Constitutional Court's decision regarding the Pietrandosi decree on maritime rescue operations?
Yeah. Well, basically, the Italian Constitution requires that Italian law and policy abide by its international commitments, and that includes the commitments it has made by signing and ratifying international human rights conventions. And it also requires Italy to abide by what's called international customary law, which is law that international law that applies to every nation, whether they've signed a particular convention or not. And in this case, the argument is that the law, that what's at stake here is the right to life, because people, as you know, many thousands of people have died in the central Mediterranean over the years. Since 2014, it's almost 32,000 people have drowned or died in other ways or disappeared in the central Mediterranean as they tried to reach Europe by boat. And it's also about the what's called the principle of non-refoulement, which is a principle of customary international law, which is a principle that protects people from being sent to a place where they face very serious harm. And that is the case for Libya. So that's one of the three constitutional questions that were raised around this, the Pietrandosi decree, which is technically a law, but it's commonly called the Gentidozzi Decree. But that's the one question that we addressed in our briefing.
And I see now how the principle of non-refoulement came in and how it related, it had to do in particular humanitarian as well. Now, what role do organizations like Human Rights Watch and ECCHR play in influencing legal proceedings related to human rights and maritime law?
Well, this is exactly one example of the kinds of things that we can do. As a human rights organization, we're not a humanitarian group that goes out and gives aid or performs the rescues at sea. But what we can do is support the arguments under international human rights law and make the arguments before the court, in this case the Constitutional Court, that to try to persuade them to find that this law is in fact unconstitutional, and that would force the government to change it. Hopefully, ideally, to repeal it, to just get rid of it completely. They could also modify it in a way that is that would respect both Italy's constitution and international human rights law. But we will have to see how the court decides.
Let's speak to limitations. I think what I want to ascertain is in what way does the Gentidozzi Decree limit capacity of rescue groups operating in the central Mediterranean Sea?
Right. So what it does is it actually severely limits the capacity of these rescue organizations to perform their humanitarian activities at sea, because it allows the authorities to detain the ships for 20 days and in some cases up to 60 days if they if they argue that the NGO in particular, in a particular case, did not follow the rules that are laid out in the law. And the main justification that is used for these what are called administrative detentions of the ships is the failure to abide by instructions of the Libyan Coast Guard. And I'll give you a very concrete example. This case began when an organization called SOS Méditerranée, one of these rescue groups, rescued 261 people, I think it was, in the central Mediterranean in February 2024. And the Libyan Coast Guard threatened them and told them to stop doing what they were doing and to leave the area. They didn't. They were faced with a situation of people in distress at sea, and so they rescued the people and they brought them to Italy. Italy detained their ship for 20 days. The organization appealed the detention, and it's basically the first judge who heard that case, who listened to their arguments about the whole process being unconstitutional, and that judge took the case to the Constitutional Court, basically went to the court and said, help me out, tell me if this is constitutional or not. Now, in that case, the Libyan Coast Guard sent an email that simply said, leave, in English, leave the area, we will do this. And they were nowhere near the area. So that's, and the law also allows the government to impose fines of thousands and thousands of euros on rescue NGOs for the same reason. So it all goes back to this question about whether we can consider the Libyan Coast Guard a reliable search and rescue actor, which we don't, and whether it is okay to leave people in distress at sea without helping them. Of course, that's not okay. And whether it's okay for people to be taken back to Libya, thrown in nightmarish detention centers, and raped and tortured and extorted and forced to work, to do forced labor, and even killed. Of course, that's not okay.
I think now this takes me to my next question. In terms of how do Italy's actions regarding the Libyan Coast Guard align or possibly conflict with its international legal obligations under human rights laws?
Well, we and others argue that Italy is, in essence, complicit in the abuse that people face, that migrants and refugees face in Libya, because of the support that it has given and continues to give to the Libyan Coast Guard, basically for years now, but really particularly since 2017. Italy and the European Union as a whole have provided financial, technical, and material support, as well as political support, to the Libyan Coast Guard. Italy helped Libya declare what's called its search and rescue area, which is the part of the sea that goes beyond their territorial waters, where they claim to, be able to perform rescues and to be in a position to coordinate rescues done by other people. And Italy has, again, adopted laws like this one, the Piantedosi Decree, essentially empowering the Libyan Coast Guard to give orders to rescue NGOs and to punish those NGOs if they don't follow what the Coast Guard does. So it's quite a serious situation.
Could you lead us to the evidence that has been presented regarding the treatment of migrants in Libya? I know that you had been talking about it, but how does this impact the legitimacy of the Libyan Coast Guard as a partner in search and rescue operations?
Yes, well, there is overwhelming evidence of brutality against migrants and refugees in Libya. We and others have been documenting really horrific conditions and treatment in detention centers in Libya for years. I myself was there in 2018 visiting 4 detention centers and talking to people and seeing how they're living and hearing about everything that they've gone through. And these are truly nightmarish places. The United Nations has, has said that the abuses that migrants and refugees face in Libya is tantamount to crimes against humanity. It's just the evidence is overwhelming. There is also a lot of evidence collected by rescue NGOs who are out there interacting with the Libyan Coast Guard, as well as others, of dangerous maneuvers by Libyan Coast Guard patrol boats, of threatening behavior, of firing at boats full of people, firing into the water near people in the water, in really distressful situations. Again, I myself witnessed. I've been out on rescue ships, and I have seen the way the Libyan patrol boats can behave in a very threatening, menacing way. So there's no question really about the unreliability and
But I would imagine, Judith, that with this the Constitutional Court considering for the first time arguments about the legitimacy of a law that imposed sanctions on sea rescue groups, I'm sure that with the work that has been put in there, the evidence that has been compiled, everything will go in accordance to the vision.
Well, we certainly hope so.
Yes.
We don't know how the court will rule, and unfortunately, we don't even know when it will rule. We hope soon, and we hope that it will be a case that really sets a very strong precedent in favor of respect for international human rights.
Thanks, Judith, for your time, and all the best.
Thank you very much.
That's Judith Sunderland, Associate Europe and Central Asia Director at Human Rights Watch, joining me earlier on the line from Rome. Follow us on social media for updates, highlights, and exclusive content on X. We are at Channel Africa 1. Facebook, we are Channel Africa 1. Instagram, at Channel Africa 1. TikTok, at Channel Africa 1. And YouTube, it's Channel Africa 1.
My name is Neto, N-E-T-O Chamani. Osiatiko, Nengezimo, Mkhandlu, Phandle kunjani moyani. Voko Tendele. Africa at Play, Asteleli Siashaya. Africa's velvet voice is in the house. Africa at Play is a place to be, where we speak all things sport and music, from the African continent to the rest of the world. We speak to your bundles of joy in sport, 12-year-olds and below, teenagers in sport. And we speak to elite athletes, administrators, coaches, and all the behind-the-scenes stakeholders of sport and music. Africa at Play, Asteleli Siashaya. Oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah.
Africa World Hour. Africa World Hour. Unpacking global headlines from an African perspective.
The Executive Director of the New South Institute, Eva Chipkin, says South Africa is not doing enough to attract young people into the private sector. Chipkin made these remarks during the launch of the Institute's first report in its New Government in Numbers series, held at the Gordon Institute of Business Science, GIBS, in Johannesburg. The report presents a data-driven account of the demographic changes currently reshaping South Africa's public administration. It highlights a significant trend. The generation of officials who joined the public service post-1994 is now approaching retirement. Channel Africa business reporter Innocent Simosa has more.
The New South Institute has launched a new report examining the state of South Africa's public service, marking the start of its government in numbers services. Yoliswa Mkasi leads the Institute's public service reform program.
Well, a lot of data analysis have gone into putting this report. We had a specific data analyst and some researchers working on it, quantitative researchers working on it. And the credibility of the report, really, we got access to raw data, which is in the PESAL, which is the personnel remuneration system for the public service that covers national and provincial employees in government.
Executive Director of the New South Institute, Ivo Chipkin, says South Africa is falling behind its global peers when it comes to succession planning, professionalization, and the overall direction of public sector reform.
We are lagging in terms of succession planning. It's an enormous opportunity for South Africa. But the report really makes the point not so much about lagging, but other countries on the continent are doing some really interesting work around bringing in youngsters and are preparing for a new generations of public service. Rwanda, for example, is leading in the space. Kenya is doing interesting work. Ethiopia, Ghana has initiated some interesting programs. Nigeria is also having some important conversations. So there are lots of experiences from elsewhere on the continent which South Africa can engage with in order to understand better how to do it.
Meanwhile, Acting Deputy National Commissioner for Support Services at the South African Police Services, Lieutenant General Leneo Nkua, says the department is working tirelessly to attract more young people into the sector.
And over and above, we also need to deploy, technology to assist us, to fight crime, because even if we can get, more money to recruit more, we won't have a police officer for each household or for each, street corner. So we'll need to use technology as well to assist our police officers to do policing effectively.
The question remains, is there commitment from government to address these issues?
There is, I will say there is a commitment from government, but we know that our economy is not doing well. Commitment is there, but the problem that we're sitting with is economy. We'll hear today with the budget speech of the Minister of Finance. What is it that is going to say?
The report sets the tone for urgent reforms as South Africa grapples with building a capable and future-ready public service. The New South Institute says more data-driven analysis will follow in this ongoing services. For Channel Africa News, I am Innocent Samos in Johannesburg.
Africa World Hour, unpacking global headlines from an African perspective.
You're listening to Channel Africa. It's Africa World Hour. And my name is Thabiso Lehoko. And it has been an eventful day, I must say, news-wise. And Africa World Hour is always there to capture the news for you and give you the news that you need that had been taking place throughout the day. My name is Thabiso Lehoko. I've been standing in for Tsepiso Makwetla. Let's do it again tomorrow. Goodbye.
Ahoy, matey!
Captain here to help, right, boys?
Set sail with us on a digital voyage like no other. Channel Africa has a treasure trove of awesomeness. That is our website and social media pages.
Tell me, why are you here?
We want you to be part of our adventure.
The winds are changing, Captain. And this time...
Imagine a world where curiosity knows no bounds, where entertainment meets enlightenment, and where every click leads to the African perspective. Visit us on our website, www.channelafrica.co.za, or follow us on Instagram or on X at Channel Africa One. Go on, like us on Facebook at Channel Africa One. So, spread the word. Tell a friend that Channel Africa's online variety is what they need on the web. Channel Africa, the African perspective. Africa World Hour. Africa World Hour. Unpacking global headlines from an African perspective.
Yeah. Alright, into me, oh, na. Yeah. Alright, into me, oh.
Black jersey on the beat.
Baby, me tired for this show matter.
Africa is a story, a living, breathing, ever-evolving masterpiece. And for over 5 decades now, one voice has told it like no other. Channel Africa. More than just a broadcaster, Channel Africa is the pulse of the continent, African-led, African-run, and deeply rooted in its heritage. It's the only international station that speaks to Africa in its own voices: English, Kiswahili, Chinyanja, French, and Portuguese. The languages that unite 1 billion people. We have been there through every shift, every milestone, and every triumph. Not just reporting history, but shaping the conversations that define Africa's future. For brands, media planning, and advertisers, Channel Africa is more than just a platform. It's an opportunity. With 25 compelling shows covering current affairs, sports, business, music, and lifestyle, we deliver an engaging Pan-African audience ready to connect, invest, and act. Multi-award winning, internationally recognized, digitally accessible across the globe. When Africa speaks, the world listens, and Channel Africa makes sure of it. For business, for culture, for Africa, partner with Channel Africa, because Africa's voice is the future. Africa is a story, a living, breathing, ever-evolving masterpiece. And for over 5 decades now, one voice has told it like no other. Channel Africa.